Good evening and welcome to British Institute for the Study of Iraq's May lecture. Delighted to see so many of you here this evening. Thank you so much for coming. It's a lecture which is not in the tradition of hybrid, which means, of course, you had to turn up to listen to it. And this is something, of course, that we'll be considering going forward in terms of our planning, what makes sense being on Zoom and what makes sense being in person. And so being in person here, I'm thrilled to see you all. Thank you very much. So I'm Paul Collins. I'm the current chair of council for the British Institute for BISI, and it's my huge pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Professor Hugh Kennedy. Professor, as you will see from the first slide, Professor of Arabic at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Prior to joining SOAS in 2007, Professor Kennedy spent 35 years teaching medieval history in the University of St Andrews. He was elected Fellow of the British Academy in 2013 and is author of numerous books on the history of the early Islamic world, including The Prophet and the Age of the Caliphate, The Courts of the Caliphs, The Great Arab Conquests, and the Caliphate, a Pelican Introduction. He is presently working on an economic history of the early Islamic Middle East to be published by Princeton University Press. But I'm thrilled to say that this evening he will be talking on the globalization of Baghdad, 762 to 1000 CE. So please join me in welcoming Professor Hugh Kennedy.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you can all hear me. I've been given strict instructions to where to stand in relation to the microphone and so on, so I better not budge. But if you can't hear me at any stage, then just raise your hand and I shall speak more loudly. I'm very pleased to be here, partly because there's all such nice people and it's a beautiful room and so on and so forth, but more particularly because, of course, I work on in Iraq in the early Islamic period, as you see up there on the screen. So I'd be very interested to get reactions from those of you who work on earlier periods of the history of Mesopotamia and so on, and whether you see parallels or differences and so on between what I'm going to be talking about. And I hope I'll explain what I think about globalization, why I use globalization, which I think is curiously appropriate, or effectively appropriate. Let's just start off with things that you all know about Baghdad, that it was founded essentially as a new town. There were settlements already on the site before them, but they were small, and people later on remembered them. They remembered where the old souk was and so on that had been before the great build-up of Baghdad. But it's really, of course, the foundation of the city by the Abbasid Caliph, the second Abbasid Caliph, Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, in the year 762, which starts the ball rolling. Baghdad, therefore, was a city of immigrants. There were very few people who could, as it were, say that their grandfathers and great-grandfathers had been there. People flocked to Baghdad from all over the Middle East. We know this a lot because the geographical writers talk about the different quarters of people, and they came from east and west, but above all from Iran and the lands beyond to make their fortunes in Baghdad. Some of them were paid soldiers and bureaucrats. Many more of them, I think, were people who came because that's where the jobs were. That's where you could make money, either, as it were, sweeping the streets, or you could make money selling things, bringing them from your native country, selling them to the elite of Baghdad. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that. It is, as again, I'm sure all of you know, a sad fact that almost, in fact, I can say absolutely nothing of this period of Abbasid Baghdad survives for us to visit today. There are buildings from the 12th century onwards on the east bank of the Tigris, in what is, one might think of the old walled city of Baghdad nowadays. But these have nothing to do with the Abbasid era. The reasons for this, people have talked, everyone talks about the Mongol conquest of 1258 and destroyed it, but in fact the changes had gone on long, long before then. The Baghdad of the Abbasids had effectively disappeared by the year 1000. The great mosque of al-Mansur, we know the date, which I've temporarily forgotten, but we know the date in the 940s when the great dome of his mosque collapsed, and it was never rebuilt. It was a storm and so on. And that represents a sort of symbolic end. So why is there nothing left and so on? I think that it's the variety of things, and one of them is the river, the Tigris. The Tigris is a fickle friend. It's essential to the well-being of the city, obviously providing water. It was at the same time the main transport route within the city. But the landscape is very flat, and the river has changed its course on numerous occasions. And at various stages, the natural shifting of the riverbed has meant that, as far as we can tell, that the Tigris actually run through or very close to the original round city and so on, and destroyed it. But the other, and equally obvious reason, is the building materials. Baghdad was essentially built in mud brick and wood and plaster. All of these are materials that disintegrate and get washed away by the rain, get burnt in fires and so on. And so nothing remains of even the great walls of the city. And there's a contrast here, which is an obvious one with Damascus, for example, which some of us were hearing about just the other day, with the new book on the Great Mosque of Damascus, where so much, because it's a stone-built city, so much of the fabric is reused and reused. The city walls are still the city walls of Roman times and so on and so forth. You've got an urban continuity in a stone-built city, which you don't have in a mud brick-built city. So how can we approach this city then? Well, with our imaginations, and with the help and guidance of an astonishingly rich body of what we call geographical writing, descriptions of the city. There are two main ones, Ali al-Kubi, writing in the 890s, and the Khatib al-Baghdadi, who produced a great biographical dictionary of Baghdad in the early 11th century, and they really walk us through the city, from the round city of al-Mansur to the outermost suburbs and the monasteries along the river and so on. So we have this, we can do all this in our imagination. And people have used these sources, of course, to try to reconstruct it. And this is something that goes on. This rather jaunty and cheerful attempt to reconstruct it, I think, makes it far too small. It gives the great round city that Abu Ja'far built, is in the center stage there, of course, and the mosque immediately inside it. All this is recorded in the geographical writings, and you see the Tigris, Bendy there. The bridges are completely wrong. All the bridges were bridges of boats. Right until the 20th century, there was no masonry or concrete bridge across the Tigris in Baghdad. We lots of pictures of bridges of boats, of course. And the other thing that I'd like to draw your attention to is these subsidiary canals, the Surat River and so on, down at the bottom there of this plan. These were smaller, but absolutely vital for the supplying of the city, for reasons that I'll try and explain later on. And of course, we can go large, so to speak, and do a completely different reconstruction of the city of Baghdad. Here is, it clearly looks very much bigger, wide open spaces, big straight streets, and so on and so forth. Whether either of these, or I think this one probably is more realistic, if you like, but whether either of them have any relation to what the city actually looked like is, of course, impossible for us to tell. So an imaginary city, but a city that's had an enormous impact on, obviously, the geography of Iraq ever since it's founded. It's been the biggest city in Iraq. And also the imagination far beyond that. The Baghdad of the great Abbasid caliphs was in so many ways the center of culture, the center of literature, the center of storytelling, of course, and the center of so many other things. So it's this. So can we have a go at the population of Baghdad? And the heyday of Baghdad, the most populous, seems to have been during the 9th century, from the late 8th century, founded, remember, in 762, so, and into the first quarter, really, of the 10th century. This was the period of maximum population. Even when the political capital moved to Samarra, Baghdad was by far the most populous city. And people are, think of a number and double it, really, but we're really talking about people talking about 500,000, and that's where current estimates really sort of settle. It might have been as small as 250,000. It might have been well more than 500,000. Whatever it was a very large city, and it was full of people who would expect and hope to get at least one meal a day. Full of people who are buying and selling and wanting things to beautify their homes and beautify their bodies and so on and so forth. Baghdad was an enormous center of demand. The Abbasid system was two features which we must think about. The first is it was a very monetary society. Lots and lots of coins were minted. Somebody's calculated between about 350,000 dirhams from the Middle Abbasid period still survive. But this is undoubtedly, mostly actually in hoards in Scandinavia and so on. But this is only a very small proportion of the money that must have been in circulation. So when we read in the Chronicles people talking about these enormous sums of money, this isn't necessarily fantastical. It does reflect the thing that money was used a lot. And money was used to pay salaries. Money was used to pay soldiers. Above all, about 70% of the Abbasid budget went directly to the army. And then there's a bureaucracy on top. And these people, the military and, as it were, the civil aristocracy, wanted just a little bit more than their one meal a day. It was a very consumerist society. You demonstrated your status with stuff. And I'll come on to stuff later on in the lecture. But in order to distinguish yourself, to make it clear that you're a person of culture and so on, you're part of the khasa, as opposed to the amma who are lying around in the street, then you distinguish yourself by stuff. And so what we must think about for working out the impact of Baghdad is demand in the economy. Economic history of the pre-modern period and the Middle Ages, particularly in Western Europe, tends to be very supply-side discussion. People suddenly get up and they start tilling new land and they employ new sheep and so on and so forth. But it only makes this demand, this supply side, and we'll look at supply side evidence a bit later on, only makes sense if there is a demand side encouraging people to do it. People go out and dig new irrigation channels once they've fed their own family, and so on. They go out and dig new irrigation channels because that investment means they can make money. And it's the gravitational of demand from Baghdad that really creates the economic ripples and the globalization that I want to talk about. And without thinking about demand, we're not really going to understand the whole interactions and so on. So we look on here. This is a Guy Lestrange's 1890s, I suppose, reconstruction of Baghdad. Guy Lestrange was a geographical historian whose works I still use all the time. And he produced this sketch map of Baghdad based entirely on the literary sources, of course. And this has remained the model for what everybody thought of Baghdad, really. Everyone's envisioned Baghdad ever since. with the great round city in the center, the canals you see at the south of the round city flowing ultimately from the Euphrates across the Tigris, and then the walled city on the eastern bank, and so on. And and everybody else has followed Lestrange. If we want to get any visual parallels, there are two places we can look to if we want to see what does any of the buildings actually look like. The first, of course, is Samarra, the ruined field of Samarra, some 100 miles north of Baghdad, which was briefly the capital of the Caliphate. But because it was only briefly the capital of the Caliphate, it was abandoned when the caliphs moved back to Baghdad at the end of the 9th century, and thereafter was left to dry out in the hot Mesopotamian sunshine, and to a remarkable extent survives. And in particular, aerophotography and so on, really since the early 20th century, you can see the patterns not just of mosques and of roads here, but you can see the patterns of buildings traced in the landscape there, which show the enormous density, the planning and the density of the housing. And here in the mosque, one of the mosques, this is just, and the famous Mawia, the famous spiral minaret there, and here some of the decorative elements from Samarra, and including the plasterwork, the gis, which was a fundamental tool of decorating rather than just seeing the bricks and so on. You covered it over with this plasterwork. But that's not, if we want to see what a mosque in Baghdad looked like, we go to Cairo. And we go to the Mosque of Ibn Tulun, built in the mid-9th century by a man, or to the orders of a man, Ibn Tulun, who had been born and brought up in Samarra. He was an element of the Samarra military, and when he came to Cairo, he built Samarra on the Nile in a small scale. But the architectural elements, not only the piers with their colonnettes on each side, but actually the plasterwork and so on in the spandrels of the arches precisely reflects Baghdad. But of course it's built in stone because this is Cairo, so we still have it today. To understand part of, at least, of what's going on in Baghdad, we have to think about Greater Mesopotamia. Now, Greater Mesopotamia is a term I like to use because it's not just Iraq. The Greater Mesopotamia that I'm interested in during the course of this lecture stretches from the great bend of the Euphrates, where the Euphrates, slightly out of the map, which is a bit unfortunate, slightly out of the map where the Euphrates comes closest to Aleppo. And it stretches right down to the headwaters of the Gulf, and includes the area of Khuzestan, now, of course, part of Iran, but where the hydrology and the landscapes and so on are very similar to Iraqi Mesopotamia. And these came to form a system, or at least a hinterland, of the city from which the city drew its resources and drew its food. The Abbasid Caliphate of the 8th, 9th, and early 10th century was the last great empire in history that was based on the resources of Greater Mesopotamia. When you think of all the states that existed before, which many of you know much more about than I do, but the pre-Islamic states and Babylonia and indeed the Sumerians and so on, these were some of the richest areas of the world and were the basis of major states and empires. The Abbasid Caliphate was the last of these. Never since then has a major political power been based in Iraq. And the Abbasids were heavily dependent on Iraq and its resources. I did, for an article I wrote some time ago, it was the back of an envelope sketch, which I think could demonstrate from the tables of tax yields of different provinces, that the taxation that was produced by Greater Mesopotamia was 4 times as much as the caliphs received from Egypt. or could extract from Egypt, 5 times as much as they could extract from the whole of Syria and Palestine. Now, these sums, in a sense, they may be unreliable. There's a bias towards Iraqi Mesopotamian resources because they were probably easier to extract and take to Baghdad than they were. So but the general indications are that this was enormously, the major contributor to Abbasid revenues. As I say, it was a very cash-based society. You needed revenues, regular supply of them, to keep the machinery of the government and, above all, the machinery of warfare working. And so we've got this, you've got this basis, this resource base in Iraq. And if it was going well, the state was very rich. If by any chance, as indeed happened, it stopped going so well, why then the state was in deep trouble. And there was another thing that is perhaps worth noticing about this Greater Mesopotamia. For most of the first half of the first millennium, this area of Greater Mesopotamia had been divided by a political boundary. Now, this is such an obvious thing that I'm surprised sometimes people don't make more of it. There was the Roman area, which we now think of Syria, Jordan, and northern Syria, particularly Syria and Jazeera, and so on. And then there was a frontier, fairly closely defined, marked by fortresses and military activity, between that and the Sasanian, or Parthian, and then Sasanian empires to the east. And this was a real frontier, and it meant that economic integration between the grain lands of the Syrian Jazeera and the date lands, as it were, of the southern part of Iraq and the great cities of Iraq, there was no economic integration, really, at least not in terms of large-scale commerce. I mean, people may have done a little bit of silk here and there, but nothing really major. The Muslim conquests change all that. This boundary disappears, and the whole of Greater Mesopotamia becomes a single, if you like, common market. There are no taxation borders between them. Trade is allowed to flourish and develop. And this means that a city like Baghdad can have access to the grain resources of the Syrian Jazeera, and, of course, the Jazeera of northern Iraq as well. And this unification certainly enabled a city like Baghdad to grow to the size we believe it did. If it didn't have that access to this agricultural hinterland, it could never have developed on that scale. And, of course, something else goes similar to the south. The dates of southern Iraq were the second main staple. But all this also was dependent on water transport. Without that, it was impossible to move the quantities of food that were necessary, must have been necessary to do these, to feed these people. And the river systems are crucial for understanding that. I wonder if we can go on to a bit another. The wiggly line represents the 200 millimeter isoyet, which is the minimum rainfall that's necessary for dry farming. So anything north and east and so on of that is can be dry farming territory. Anything in the south and west cannot. But water transport basically means the great rivers, the Tigris, and especially the Euphrates. And that's where these canals that I was mentioning in the plan of Baghdad come in so important, because they were developed in Sasanian times, maintained in early Islamic times, and the minor project at the moment trying to work out when they stopped being maintained, because they were vital for bringing grain and other goods that was floated down the Euphrates across to Baghdad, which of course sits on the Tigris. And that means that the city of Baghdad that's on the Tigris was also integrated into the Euphrates economic system and everything that enabled things to go. The water transport in southern Iraq was much easier because the land is extremely flat and the currents are very still, so you can actually move upstream. But the system seems to have been very similar to one described as by Herodotus, in about 500 BC, that basically goods and grains and so on were harvested in the Jazeera. They were floated down the river in rafts, which were built from wood in the forests of what is now southern Turkey, and so on. When they reached the great cities, and we're probably thinking of Babylon and so on at this stage, when they reached the great cities of Iraq, not only was the grain sold, but the rafts were broken up and sold for roofing material and all the things that people needed wood for. And the people who brought them down hired donkeys, get back up again and do the same thing next year. It was, in a way, a perfect circle of economic activity. So water transport, absolutely fundamental. Now a third, or fourth, or fifth, or whatever it is, characteristic of this landscape is that it is marginal for farming. A lot of it is marginal farming. If the circumstances are right, if there is political stability, if there is demand for goods and supplies, why then areas will be brought under cultivation and villages will be founded, little towns will be founded, and so on. We have a huge amount of documentation, both written and archaeological, for this process going on in the earlier Abbasid period. If the circumstances change, if the market disappears, if there's chaos and you can't transport goods safely, why then these areas will cease to be inhabited. And lots of the people will fundamentally become pastoralists, or, if you like, they become Bedouin, because pastoralists have more options and more secure options in times of insecurity and so on than people who are attached to fields and villages and so on, which can be looted and raided and burnt and so on and so forth. So that's why you get the great re-emergence of great Bedouin tribes in 10th century Iraq and Syria as major political forces. But that's not what I want to concentrate so much on today. How do we think we know these things? Well, this is just another map of the area just beyond between the 200 and 300 millimeter IC at night. And just some views to give you an idea. This is the Tigris, just north of Mosul, I think. And this is the River Euphrates, the Euphrates Valley near Deir ez-Zor. And, you know, the characteristics of this, I took this photograph ages ago, standing on the escarpment, which represents, behind me is the desert. It's gravel and sand, but nothing grows. And then between the escarpment and the river is a riverine plain. And by leading, and we'll see this in the plan in a minute, by leading canals off the river along the bottom of the escarpment and then running feeder canals from this main canal down to the river, you can water by gravity large areas, just as we see being done here, and the green over there. Now, there have been a number of archaeological surveys which tell us a lot about these things. This is just one example. There's a major survey of the Middle Euphrates Valley done by Sophie Berthier and her team of French archaeologists. But there are other Karen Bartle working in the Khabur River Valley and so on. They all tell the same story. But I'll just use the Sophie Berthier's plans and so on for this illustration. And what she has done, or what she does in these illustrations, is to look at the settlements in this Middle Euphrates area, an area which, of course, completely impossible for any of us to go to now, even think of going to now. But this was in the 1990s, I suppose, and she could do it and work there in ways that we can only imagine and dream of. And this is the number of settlements. And I'm going to move away from the microphones for a second, just because I want to point to things. I don't need a pointer here. I should have thought that before, shouldn't Um, So what we're seeing here is the Euphrates Valley, with the river winding through the riverine plains and the escarpment on both sides. You will notice there's one river, the Khabur, that flows into the Euphrates there. And this was the site of a now largely disappeared town called Circesium or Circesium, which was the furthest outpost of Roman rule in this direction. And it was founded just where the river Khabur comes into Euphrates. And so that represents the frontier. And you can see that there is almost no settlement. These places, Mayadin and Al-Ashara, that you see there, are modern. They don't reflect the ancient geography at all. It's only around the Roman military outpost that you get any permanent settlement. And that, we must presume, relates in some way to the feeding of the Roman garrison there or something like that. But when we go a little bit further into the Abbasid period here, we see a very different picture. What has happened? Well, big canals have been run, like the Nahar Dawrin here, have been run along the foot of the escarpment, just the escarpment we were looking at a moment ago. There are traces of other ones further up on the west bank as well, and we have a lot of literary accounts of who built them, who dug these things, and so on. And then we have a mass of settlements. Lots of them are small rural settlements. They're unfortified, they're not even towns. Some of them just seem to be isolated farms or groups of farms and so on. This population has suddenly expanded enormously. People are moving into these lands, developing these lands, and we must presume making money out of these lands. The key to it is the big canals and the area between the big canals and the main river, or the riverine plain. And here again, we must look to exactly this period, the period when this great expansion of rural settlement up and down the Euphrates is occurring, is exactly the period when the city of Baghdad is expanding, growing, when 500,000 people want breakfast every day. And these must be connected, I think. No. And so the Abbasid period, this process has started in various ways in the Umayyad period, but it's in a rather different way, which I don't want you to go into. The Abbasid period is this. Now, here we go into the 10th century, and we see a terrific abatement. At least half the settlements, no, more than half the settlement. Sorry, I haven't got the... I don't know, for some reason, yes, Hamdani, the late 10th century shows a dramatic abatement of settlement. The Dawrin Canal still functions, the canals on the West Bank don't, but the number of settlements is drastically reduced. And this reflects, again, what's going on in Baghdad and the disasters of the mid-10th century in the city of Baghdad, and the economic warfare that resulted, because the Hamdani dynasty, who were ruling the Syrian Jazeera and so on at this stage, used food blockades as a way of controlling their opponents in Baghdad. You start to get famine. Some of it's just because the markets now don't encourage people to grow stuff, but partly deliberate economic warfare and, if you like, economic sabotage and so on and so forth. So my argument of this stage of globalization, there's one other point I want to make actually, which shows no archaeological evidence at all. What about meat? Because, this was people who could afford to like to eat meat. And of course, for the main festivals of the Muslim year and so on, you need to be able to make your sacrifices and so on and so forth. But of course, it's very difficult to see this in the archaeological landscape. What we do know from literary sources is accounts of enormous numbers of sheep being reared and sold in the uplands areas of what is now Persian Azerbaijan and eastern Armenia, the high pastures there. And we are given figures of hundreds of thousands of sheep being marketed and so on in these areas in the geography of Ibn Hawkal. And Ibn Hawkal, writing about 960, says this used to happen, but it doesn't happen anymore. And what they were doing, I'm absolutely sure, was not raising these enormous numbers of sheep for the small townships of the foothills of the Caucasus. They were raising an enormous number of sheep for sale in the Baghdad markets and so on and so forth. I'd love to be able to have more details also, even some hard archaeology for this, but we just have to imagine it. So what I'm saying is that the growth and abatement of Baghdad as a population center, as an economic center, has a profound effect on the landscapes of Greater Mesopotamia, all the way from, I say, the Great Bend of the Euphrates down to the Gulf, and recent work that's been done by a young Iranian-American archaeologist called Mehranoush Sorosh, working on the landscapes of Khuzestan, presents exactly the same sort of picture, the same timetable of growth and decline and so on. But I want to, having dealt with breakfast, so to speak, and everyday food, I want to move on a bit to the question of, this was, as I said, a very consumerist society. You demonstrated your status, you demonstrated your position in society with stuff. Now, it's going to... Yeah, that looks better, doesn't it? These are really basic pictures of boat traffic. No, you don't. Anyway, normal service will be resumed soon. I just want to... And the luxury goods and so on. Interestingly, neither, certainly in the literary sources, we don't get references to people's houses. Or rather we do, but we don't get a cult of domestic architecture, which you might imagine in a rich and consumerate society, people would be going on about other people's houses, how grand they were, how beautiful they were, how wonderful the gardens were, how some fabulous the stuccos were, and so on. But there is very, very little of that. It wasn't by your domestic accommodation that you distinguish yourselves, but by the stuff that you put in your house and wore around your body. Above all, of course, it was textiles. And this is where the archaeology is really, I suppose it lets us down, is the only way of saying it. There's so little archaeological evidence of textiles from this period. And the main source of such textiles as there are is almost ironically French cathedral treasuries, where Middle Eastern textiles were used for wrapping up those most precious possessions, the bones of saints. And recent work has been done in cataloguing Oriental textiles in French cathedral treasuries because they can often be dated quite accurately as well. And this is the major source of these remains. But we know a lot from literary sources about them. And with textiles went... we're seeing this man in his talking about boats. Let's just have let's have an interlude of boats for a moment. And this is just giving you an idea. These wonderful guffas, which sort of used to be and so characteristic of the waterways of southern Iraq. I don't know whether any still exist. Has anyone seen one recently, or have they completely disappeared? right, that's it. True. And they were very useful for going downstream and so on. Going up the stream was rather more discouraging, as you can see from these poor people pulling their boat up the Euphrates or something. And just as this, I see you think, now I'll leave that rather delightful picture of the Basra waterways and so on. But right, the other things, along with textiles go dyestuffs. And of course, in pre-modern times, dyestuffs had to be procured, often from a long way away, often at great expense. Nowadays, of course, you make any colour you want to in a sort of chemical vat and so on. But until the 19th century, that really wasn't true. And so when we're thinking of textiles, we have to think of dyestuffs too. And it's dyestuffs, perhaps, that determine where the most important textiles come from. Take crimson. Crimson, dark red, comes from the ground-up beetles that live in Armenian hills. They don't live anywhere else. They just live there. If you want to get this colour in your fabrics, and they did because it's rich and gorgeous, why then you had to grind up a whole lot of beetles in Armenia. Or more particularly, you had to pay somebody else to grind up a whole lot of beetles in Armenia. But the point I'm making is that this sort of luxury textile trade couldn't just be moved around the world. It was based in the resources of Armenia here, or in Armenia to the north, but the Baghdad market was actually fueling the demand for crimson. Another interesting example of the desire for textiles can be taken from Narshaki's History of Bukhara. This is a 10th century history of Bukhara that only survives actually in a later Persian translation, originally written in Arabic. But he's talking about a textile factory in Bukhara. And he's talking in around the 980s about something that used to be in Bukhara and isn't anymore. And it was a special factory where they wove really, really fine, delicate fabrics, which were sent to Iraq and to fuel the market there. And he says, in recent years, this is the 10th century when Baghdad is going through a whole series of economic crises, this factory fell into disuse. Nobody makes these textiles anymore. Furthermore, there was nobody around who still remembered how they were made. The whole technology, the collapse of the Baghdad market had destroyed this technology. It's this luxury technology. There was no demand for it anymore. Everyone forgot how to do it, and they went off and did other things that were more immediately profitable. And I think this is both the Armenian crimson and the textiles of Bukhara give us a rather interesting economic model here. Because it's easy to look at something like the Abbasid Caliphate, or a state like the Abbasid Caliphate, and see it as extractive and exploitative. That it's a one-way street, that they use their military authority basically for taking things from the subject peoples and so on. But if we think about how these two models work, it's not as simple as that, is it? The demand for crimson textiles and fine textiles from Bukhara, in fact, generates jobs and work in Armenia and in Bukhara. There is an economic interaction between provinces and the capital that we often, I think, miss, and which in many ways must have accounted for the success, or at least the survival, of big empires like this. So, another thing that we hear a lot about is foodstuffs. The Abbasid Caliphate produces at least one major cookbook, and cookbooks are very interesting because, of course, like the recipes you see in Sunday papers, they're essentially aspirational rather than something that ordinary people might do. But they show you what you should be doing if you want to be part of the elite. How you should prepare your food, don't spit in it, how you should wash your hands, and the preparations. And elite food is elite in two ways. It's elite because it takes a lot of preparation. You have to spend the whole day grinding and cutting and so on and so forth. But also because it imports things from far, far away. And that makes it expensive and so on. So that's the way you establish your credentials in this way. And I'd like, again, just to think of two examples. One is the melons of Merv, the dried melons of Merv. Okay, Merv in Turkmenistan now, very big city in northeast Iran in Muslim times. Oh, it's a complete rainfield now. But melons, dried melons, were exported from Merv to Iraq, often in sort of silver containers, some of which still survive, I think. Now, this is an extraordinary thing because it's quite possible to grow melons in the outskirts of Baghdad. You've got water, you've got sunshine, and you can do melons there. But discriminating palates in Baghdad were convinced that the dried melons of Merv were superior to anything you get in Iraq. So they were prepared to pay large sums of money to get these melons transported 1,000 miles from Merv to Baghdad. And this, when we're looking at economy, this points to economic complexity, and it also points to an economic hierarchy. By finding this fabulous food, then you demonstrate your wealth and your status and your worth as a player. And you can imagine people sitting around in Baghdad saying, these melons from Merv are the most delicious thing, in a way that we might sort of taste fine wine, or some of us might taste fine wine and say, oh, this is exquisite, and so on. It's high-value foodstuffs are a big generator of economic activity. And the other thing, I could have chosen a lot of, but the other thing that we find, of course, are cloves, those little cloves that you put in apple pies and wherever you put them, and so on and so forth. Now, I hadn't realized this till quite recently, and somebody told me, and it may be wrong, but until the 19th century, all the cloves in the world came from two small islands in the Indonesian archipelago, which were sometimes known as Spice Islands for obvious reasons. That's the only place they grew. And in the 19th century, they start transplanted to Zanzibar, and you get the proliferation, the globalization of cloves, if you like. But this is so interesting because no Muslim, as far as we know, ever went from Iraq to the two small islands off the north coast of Indonesia. They may have done, but if they didn't tell us about it, and no record of them survives. So these cloves must have been brought by a whole system of cabotage, not sabotage, cabotage. That is moving cargoes from one boat to another on a whole series of short voyages, which eventually means that they end up in Baghdad. That is the power of the Baghdad market. You only do that sort of thing if you've got somewhere to sell them and a market for them. And astonishing, cloves appear in Western Europe and in sort of Carolingian cuisine and so on during the same period. But I love the example of cloves because it's very specific and it shows you how economic demand creates that sort of globalization. Not a globalization that loads of Muslims went and farmed cloves in this area, but the globalization that means that it draws commercial products from far, far away into the center. And we can do a bit with ceramics as well. And a lot of you may be familiar with the Belatung shipwreck, with various aspects of which are quite controversial, but this is a reconstruction. This is not the Belatung ship. This is a reconstruction. The Belatung ship went down in a shipwreck off the coast of Java in about 830 of the Common Era. And it lay on the bottom of the sea until it was rediscovered in, I think, the first decade of this century and started to be excavated. Now, I just want to... And in it were found, in this comparatively modest-sized ship, some 60,000, that's 60,000 pieces of painted ceramics. There they all are, you see, sort of all packed very neatly. Get as many as you can in the boat. This is a view of them as they existed. They were found on the seabed. But when you, as it were, put them through the dishwasher, this is what you get. And you get these very characteristic ceramics. Now, there are lots of things to be said about the Belatung shipwreck. There's a great website if you're interested in these things so that you can pursue these items through. But the point of view, that from what we're interested in, the boat seems to be a Gulfy boat from the timber and the construction techniques. The ceramics, we know, come from inland China. A place called Chengdu, I think, I forget. Somebody must know that, Changshu. Anyway, but they're not like the contemporary ceramics that we find in China at that period. They're made for an export market. They are, if you like, cheap and cheerful. They're made for an export market, whereas the contemporary Chinese ceramics tend to be in very sort of elegant shades of grey and a different sort of aesthetic entirely. So Chinese people are making ceramics decorated in a style that they thought would appeal to a Baghdad market, or at least a market that was served by the trade routes of the Gulf. And the fact that there were 60,000 on one boat, but this can't have been the only boat that was doing this. There must have been, the very fact that they were designing stuff for an export market must have meant that they knew what the export market was like. Now, we do find Chinese ceramics in contemporary excavations, but not very many of them. But the Belaton shipwreck is, so to speak, a fact on the ground. You have to, this is obviously something important is going on here. You have to try and make sense of it. You have to bring it into a system. And I think, again, it shows the globalization of Baghdad, because here are all these people in inland China churning out this stuff because they know that people in the West, as far as I'm concerned, people in the West wanted it. Have we heard anything like that before? Anyway, there's nothing new under the sun, is there? Here are some more of this. But I want to finish up talking about luxury goods with something that may not seem as luxury. This is an Arabic manuscript. It's a paper manuscript. It is a Gharib al-Hadith, that is a collection of strange and unusual hadiths that was put together by a man called Al-Qasim ibn Salam in the 840s, 850s, I should remember the exact date. It lives in, it says 860 on here, so I must have got it from there. It survives at the moment in the rare books collection in Leiden University Library, where I took these photographs. But it's interesting because it is claimed by the librarians who know about these things. This is the oldest surviving complete paper book in the world. Now, this represents a moment in the transformation. We know that amongst the other things, along with their crimson robes and their fine china and so on, that the elite of Baghdad were interested in was books, book production, and authorship. That's what you get in a very big town like that. And we know there were book souks where you could, the 100 shops, the Al-Qubi tells us, and so on and so forth. And again, of course, it's using a new technology that is ultimately imported from China. The whole question of the importation of paper is not yet entirely clear. But what is clear, it's in the early Abbasid period that paper starts to be used in large quantities for writing actually very large books. And it transforms the production of knowledge because paper is so much cheaper and more versatile than the papyrus and so on, and the parchment that was being used before. So here again, we've got how a big city creates a globalization. It creates a new way of spreading knowledge, passing on knowledge. And it does so because this is a rich city where elegant and important people think that they should have a fine library of books of the sort that you might find in an 18th century English country house, and possibly not read much more than they were either. But this is one of the signs of status, and you use an imported technology from the Far East to generate this new cultural activity. I could go on, as you can imagine. I could go on for ages with this, but I just want to make two final points. The second is the Great Baghdad boom was quite short-lived. In the 10th century, things start to change quite quickly, and we can tell particularly things like the shift in trade from Indian Ocean trade from the Gulf to the Nile, or the Gulf to the Red Sea, absolutely fundamentally. Coming of the Fatimids with their wonderful gold coins from the Wadi al-Alaki silver mines, gold mines, sorry, and that represents, it's now Egypt from the mid-10th century. If you want to make money, you go to Egypt to do it. And we know that because the people who make lusterware pottery, which is the finest sort of metallic ceramics and so on, up sticks, they left Samarra, they left the Jazeera, and they went to work in Cairo. And we know that because the products of their industry have come down to us. And so on. We see the economic shift there. And we see in Iraq the deserted villages whose inhabitants have left left the farms and irrigation churches that their ancestors created because there's no longer secure enough and no longer a market. So what I tried to do in this rather broad brush lecture is to suggest that the development of this megalopolis had a profound effect, not just on the countrysides of Iraq, not just on urbanism and so on, but on, and I think it's fair enough to talk about a globalization. If you're getting clothes from Indonesia and China from northern China, then you're talking about a globalization of products and economy. And I think this is a very striking development, very complex, very interesting, very fruitful development. And that's one of the things I'm trying to work on in this book on the Islamic economy that I'm writing at the moment. This is one of the things that I'm going to be concentrating on. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention.